to preface a little bit in my conversation today, my intent in discussing bullying from the perspective that I'm going to try to take it from is probably not what you expected necessarily when you signed up for this workshop, so I hope you're not disappointed in that regard. You can go on the internet and there's thousands probably of websites and blogs and all sorts of things that are out there to kind of vilify bullies and have this whole focus on, you know, how to get your child to stand up to a bully and how do you identify if your child is a bully. And one of the themes that I recognize really, really quickly as I'm looking through those kinds of resources, and I did look through a lot of those websites and trying to pull together information, is that there's so much shame put on the bully in that whole context, and targeting that, you know, individual child without much consideration of the context in which that child is functioning, the family environment that they're coming from, the school environment, the classroom environment, and that doesn't work. So the more we identify this one person and make them a scapegoat for the problems in the system, that might make us feel better, but it doesn't change anything. And one of the biggest emphases that I have as a family therapist, as a marriage and family therapist, is trying to look at things more systemically and understanding where is this behavior coming from. And so in a long time now of family therapy practice and trying to understand for kids that I work with and what's the systemic process happening between them and their parents that is contributing to behavior problems or emotional problems, the more I hear stories from kids about school, and especially now as I have my own kids going through school and having their own stories that they come home and tell me about, situations between themselves and their peers or things that they overhear in classrooms, it's not just about that one child. And a lot of times it's not something that we as parents know is happening, that's going on in schools. So as I had all of these experiences and different information, my perspective on this whole topic really did shift a few years ago as I got introduced to Brene Brown's work. I don't know how many of you are familiar with her. A handful. If nothing else happens for you today as you leave this workshop, go read some of her stuff. It's awesome. But she's a shame and vulnerability researcher at the University of Houston and has done a ton of qualitative research interviewing people around those topics, and has written several books, some that I'll reference, around parenting and how our own selves as parents and individuals and as educators plays into the shame and vulnerability that kids that we interact with can experience, and how that really does shape the culture in which they're living, whether it be the family culture or the school culture or the gymnastics team culture or the soccer team culture, you know, whatever situations that they're or contexts that they're in. So that's kind of where we're going. But first I want to talk a little bit about the definition of bullying. And the reality is we don't have a single definition of bullying. When you go to all those different thousands of websites, there's so much muddiness, you know, when they're talking about, and there's some places where you'll see it said that every child in America has been a victim of bullying in some form or the other, which I kind of disagree with to some extent. I think as that kind of statistic is being put out there, there's a confusion between true bullying and meanness that happens between people. There's meanness that happens between us as adults all the time too, but I don't define myself as a victim of bullying necessarily. So we'll talk about Bullying is really more, and sadly I don't think I have that actually on that slide, but I want to talk about bullying as more of a pattern of behavior and not a single incident. And there's situations where bullying is physical. So for example, if there's a pattern of behavior of a child walking down the hall, and every time they encounter a certain other child, they push them up against the locker, or I don't know how many of you are Glee fans, but one of the bullying situations in Glee is that whoever gets the slushie poured on them. There's a pattern of behavior where this certain group of kids does the same behavior over and over again to a identified target, which would definitely be identified as bullying. Relational aggression, relational bullying is historically more correlated with girls, but I really see that being maybe too simplistic of a distinction, because it happens a lot with boys too, even though we might not identify it in the same way. But relational aggression is more along the lines of, if you don't let me play with that, I'm trying to think of an example. If you don't play with me at recess and not let so-and-so play, then I'm not going to be your friend anymore. My daughter's going into second grade, so this is a thing that we hear a lot. It's the I'm not going to be your friend if kind of. And there's certainly a coercion that is active in that kind of situation. But again, whether it's really something that's truly bullying becomes whether that's a pattern or not. Because one of the things that I wanted us to talk about more as we get into how do we shape a really positive culture for kids is how do we help kids understand how to share and allow multiple influence. One of my biggest struggles as a parent over the last year was my daughter coming home in first grade and telling me, so-and-so, I'll make up a name, Sarah, has said that she's not my friend anymore. Sarah's been her friend for 3 years since preschool, and has been a significant part of our lives. And so as my daughter's telling me this in tears, I'm like, well, what's going on? And according to my 6-year-old, which I have to recognize is a 6-year-old who's telling me her version of reality, this other child has told her that, if you don't do these things, then I'm not going to be your friend. And she's feeling like, this one child is trying to push her to only be her friend and not anybody else's friend. And so as we're having all these conversations, where one, I'm trying to coach her into how to respond to those situations. Part of me is going, well, what other adults around her at school could she go talk to and that could try to help? Because I know this other child too, and I know she's not a bad kid. I know her family. So there's certainly part of me that wants to go, okay, well, just don't ever talk to her again if she hurts your feelings. But I know that's not going to work either. So there's a lot of, unfortunately, those kinds of situations that get labeled as bullying. And then right now, the way that the connotation that word has in our culture makes there immediately be a division and a disconnection that happens where the potential for the conversation to repair and reconnect in that relationship between the children, between the parents, for the kids doesn't happen, and it further isolates and gets a label put on certain kids that is really counterproductive. So let's see what else. I want to say a little bit about developmental course. And to some extent talking specifically about developmental course of aggression and different kinds of aggression. I taught preschool for 3 years, way back when I was working on my master's degree. And one of the things that fascinated me and really made me want to get involved in child therapy in the first place was seeing 3-year-olds that could come to school and have these like little gangs that were running around. Like, so what's going on with this 3-year-old child that they know that if I say a certain thing or do a certain thing toward this other child, I have power over them. And so actually my dissertation topic was on that. And so I got to learn a lot about the coercive interaction processes between parents and kids, and understanding the connection between that scene that we've all experienced either as a bystander or as a parent at HEB in the grocery line as you're checking out, where of course they've got all the candy that's right there for you to go buy, and your child is saying, can I have that, or I want this? And so what the coercive process looks like, and how parents so unintentionally can lay this out early on is, the child says, I want this, and mom says, or dad says, I'm not going to just pick on moms. Parent says, no, we're just here for these groceries. But I really, really want it. No, I said no. Okay, fine. Give it to me, just stop. Because it's embarrassing, right? And then that child says, oh, that worked. Whether they say that consciously or not, they get it, that works. When I scream, when I yell, when I kick, when I hit, if that works to get what I want, then I learned very quickly that gives me power over other people. And so there's this really interesting developmental course. I won't take up too much time in this presentation because it's somewhat off topic. But there's some really interesting research on how that process changes as language develops for kids. That as kids can be really skillful in their verbal communication, that those kinds of coercive behaviors can lessen over time. And if you watch, if you spend much time in a preschool, the kids that are acting aggressively in the toddler room, as they get more into 3 and 4-year-old age range, then oftentimes that aggression goes down because they learn how to express themselves and get their needs met in other ways. So speech delays and language delays often do have a correlation between or with aggression. But again, that's not the same thing as bullying. And it's important for us to draw the distinction between those and not muddy the definition. The traditional interventions, and I'm assuming this isn't really news to many people here, that how many of you would say you had stories of even going home for yourself when you were a kid and saying, so-and-so is picking on me, so-and-so is being mean to me, so-and-so is bullying me, and somebody told you to do what? Stand up to them, tell them off, punch them in the nose, stand up for yourself. It's just like fight kind of mentality, or completely avoid them. So often the advice and the strategies that we teach kids are kind of the fight or flight, right? We go into one or the other directions. And as intuitive as that really can seem in situations where I'm a target, a negative target, it doesn't change that pattern of interaction most often. So there's all sorts of programs that can go in and out of schools, and I've seen now, as my son's going into 7th grade now, with each school year is they have some sort of different program that the counselors come through with and have some sort of, and I'm not saying this in a negative way against schools, I know there's positive benefits from each one of these kinds of programs, but I think so often they do really miss the mark of how do we as a school culture still shift in a different direction to remove the necessity of bullying behavior in the first place. some of the stories I'm sure that we could all tell of interventions that we've seen happen to kids that are identified as bullies. They get recess taken away, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension. They have to write an essay about whatever. I've even seen kids like in the shame corner of the classroom. You know, if you can't keep your hands off of so-and-so or leave so-and-so alone, which isn't necessarily just bullying behavior, even though sometimes it gets framed as, you know, I see it as more impulsive kinds of stuff, but sometimes it gets framed in situations as bullying because it's picking on the other child. So they get their own desk alone that faces them in the corner. Just as well put the dunce hat on their heads. And so there's the social exclusion, there's the intensification of punishment, avoidance, and all of those things, again, go to more of an isolation of this person and a disconnection of them with other people around them. Which, what do we think that does? Often, yeah.
Yes, it does. The child already, he already has such a low self-esteem. I would see those children are how and just to be properly accomplished. At least that's how I see it. You're not addressing the cause.
Right. If we're not addressing the cause of the behavior, then all we're doing is having that positive feedback loop where I'm just piling more on, and at some point there's going to be a breakdown, and we don't really know what that's going to look like. Sometimes that breakdown of that positive feedback loop is acting out against, Columbine kinds of things as examples, or runaway, suicide, dropout. There's all sorts of ways that gets turned inward or outward, depending on at what point it really culminates.